Hello. Hey, good morning, good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us again on this week's Freight Market Roundup. I want to apologize in advance. I have got a sinus infection, so I may be sniffling. I'm going to be drinking quite a lot of water, but we're going to get through this together, just like we have throughout the freight market for many years now. So thanks again for joining. And as always, I want to give a huge shout out to our Director of Marketing, Vanessa Fry. We're actually streaming on a totally different platform today. She was able to put the whole thing together totally stress-free. It was awesome. Without her, this show would not be possible. We would not have been live for this long. So send her an email thank you if you enjoy watching Anthony and I and this show. I'm Jason Brand. I'm the Director of Outreach and Partner Development at Supply Chain Solutions. I'm generally joined by my co-host, Anthony D'Ambrosio. He is the Vice President of Sales. Unfortunately, he is busy with sales right now, so he won't be joining us this week, but he definitely will be back next week to talk about a topic that I will go over here soon. We've got a schedule we like to keep on this show. So if you are used to it, this will be a little bit of a repeat, but if you are not, tune in. This week's all about the Freight Market Roundup. So just to make sure that you know what the format we like to kind of go through here is, we want to keep it digestible and we want to keep it just easy to follow along with. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to run through each of our major trade lanes. I'm going to start with the Trans-Pacific lanes. I'm going to move over to the transatlantic lanes. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the Suez. So our China to Europe shipping lane. Between each section, I'll throw in some current events that we're talking about internally that we are seeing or our clients are asking us about or our clients are dealing with. It's not going to be everything. It's kind of hard to pick and choose sometimes. And especially lately, there's been so much just groundbreaking things happening literally all of the time. It can be really hard to decipher what we need to talk about, what we need to focus on. If you feel like we missed something important, please let us know. We really want to keep in mind what you're thinking about, and we'd love to kind of dive down those rabbit holes with you and learn more and add them into our future shows as well. So thanks again for joining us today on our Freight Market Roundup, and we are going to dive right in. So as I said, Trans-Pacific lanes first. We're going to be starting with our China and Southeast Asia to U.S. West Coast lane. Now, to just cut to the absolute chase, we are seeing rates, just the ocean portion right now, at under $1,000. And this is as of last week. And I'm personally in complete disbelief. If you've been with us for a while, you've heard me mention, I think we're at the glass floor on this lane, literally since December, and it just keeps creeping down and down and down. But before I kind of diverge any more than I already have, let's quick talk about the East Coast counterpart. So remember, now we're shipping out of China, Southeast Asia. We're going into US East Coast ports. What we are seeing right now, and this is rates compiled as of last week, it's right now for us, $2,250. That was our average. And, it's kind of crazy that those rates are that low. You just heard 1,000 for the West Coast ports, but remember the East Coast ports, it's a lot more distance. Those ports don't have as much throughput. They're more congested than the rest of the ports are right now. And we're literally seeing below cost rates going into those ports. Actually, looking from last week and the week before, we saw our rates go down by roughly 3%. So it's still kind of inching downwards. I'd really be surprised if it goes any lower. But you know what? I mean, I have been blown away each week, so maybe I really won't be surprised. But stay tuned. When we kind of compare this, though, kind of like I slightly did, to the West Coast ports, the West Coast ports, even though, so week over week, they went also down by around 3%, but they're still kind of blowing the East Coast ports out of the water. And that's because around 3 weeks ago to 2 weeks back, we saw our rates decrease by almost 12%. And we were getting great rates. I mean, our customers were telling us we were getting great rates. So to see a whole across the board decline of double digits when it was so low already is just mind blowing. And I just mentioned this. So week over week, not obviously including this week because we're just compiling, we saw a 3% decline. So both across the board, China, Southeast Asia, coming to the US, basically a 3% decline. Kind of mind blowing. Couple of things we should be talking about because there's a lot going on. I'm just going to talk about a few. So firstly, the FMC, they're expected to enforce new rulemaking around detention and demurrage costs. And this is part of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. So I'm sure you've heard of this. We actually mentioned it in the show a couple of weeks ago, the acronym OSRA. It was actually enacted last year, and it is a huge deal because If you've been shipping for a while, you've definitely dealt with the merchant detention. If you've been shipping in the past couple years, chances are you definitely did and potentially saw just unfair numbers. So there was a conference a couple weeks back during our last Freight Market Roundup. I talked about it a few times. Conference is called TPM, and this year's 23, so it's TPM 23, and happens in California, right by the ports. It's very cool. A lot of people get involved. It's because the pandemic, it's been, I believe it was on Zoom last year, and Zoom just doesn't give you the chance to really, it's in-person events do a heck of a lot. And but you get key players from your ocean vessel operators, your port terminals are there, you've got huge shippers there, and they're all kind of duking it out right there in public. It's really exciting to see. I wasn't able to go, so I'm very jealous. But oh my gosh, the amount of content that came out of that, I felt like I was there. So it's pretty cool. But um, one of the things that came out of this, and one of the big questions that kept getting brought up, was this Ocean Shipping Reform Act. And it was the executives representing the major ports who were getting asked this question, and just all sorts of questions about it. And I don't have a lot of good answers for you on what they were saying, but the general tone across the board was they are not excited about this. They started to point at things like, well, you'll see issues with your containers, with the fluidity and the throughput and things like that. I think we all can agree that demergent detention was a little out of control at times, especially if you were a target of it. Um, Obviously, we saw a lot of different solutions that were imposed during the pandemic as like trying to solve problems. Like, why aren't we getting more chassis? Well, let's find this person to incentivize them to get the chassis back, and yada yada yada. So the ports were essentially saying, well, we need this practice to keep things moving. Well, if you've gotten one of those bills, I think we can all agree that that's a little bit of a ridiculous amount for those costs. It's a little bit of reform I don't think is going to affect fluidity as much as they're making it sound. Anyways, this is the focus of our next week's show, OSRA. Anthony's going to be doing a deep dive in. I'm going to be there with him. We'll be talking about it. And I know it's affected some of our regular viewers because we've gotten questions about it in the past. So make sure you tune in. And also, if you don't have the link or you have somebody else who wants the link, send it over. Good deep dive on that topic. And it's a great time to talk about that topic too. Now, another topic that was very prevalent at this conference, and this is something that's, still with, well, I'll just dive into it. It's basically talking about carbon. It's talking about greener shipments. It's talking about reducing carbon. Now, obviously, unless you've been blind and been completely living in a cave, you've probably seen there's been a just escalation of the argument of carbon, and we've been making the switch. Obviously the car manufacturers are now making a lot of electric vehicles and things like that. But what is interesting is every year we've already had carbon or just initiatives to reduce pollution in the ocean shipping industry, but it really seems to be heating up. And this conference, it was definitely, if not more asked than the demergent detention questions, was actually talking about carbon, which was very, very interesting. It's always been a topic, always a top 10 topic, but seeing it like almost in the #1 spot was definitely a change. Now, one shipper is really kind of trying to show off and get involved pretty deeply. So this was DB Schenker, and they inked a deal with MSC, and they're going to offer net zero emission for ocean shipments. And it's kind of an interesting way that they're doing it. And so what they're going to do is they secured roughly 12,000 metric tons of biofuel, and they're going to take that fuel and they're going to mix it with regular fossil-based marine fuels. And then not all, but a total of 30,000 TUs of shipments over the course of 2023 are going to use this mixture. And then they're also going to be able to essentially certify to shippers that this went on this, lower carbon or carbon neutral shipping method. Now, I kind of gave away my opinion on this because I didn't get a chance to dive in too deep to this, but if it's being mixed with regular fossil fuels, I mean, sounds like a great improvement, but I guess I need to dive in a little bit more and understand how they're calling this carbon net zero. And that's what I need to see. But it is cool to kind of see us progressing. And so more on that in the future. I'm definitely going to have to dive in and formulate my opinion over the next couple of weeks. So all these opinions, very surface right now. Soon you'll hear more from me on that. Now, unfortunately, onto some bad news. And honestly, it's a good segue to our transatlantic lanes. But it's these dang port negotiations, these port labor negotiations. So if you were on the show last week and the week before, I kind of talked about how right now we still have the West Coast port negotiations, the longshoreman negotiations. They started all the way back in the beginning of summer last year. They hit a bunch of different, very challenging points. They got put on pause. We had a slowdown. We had a series of strikes. Northern on the West Coast had some serious issues. We had parallel unions fighting each other. It was just a total mess. Well, it's not done yet. And then on top of that, our East Coast longshoremen decided to, versus wait, which their contract is not up yet, they decided to start negotiating early. And here's the concern here, from my point of view, from a risk standpoint, to our customers, to just shippers into the US in general. It's more than the East Coast. We actually have, if you look at the total of port labor negotiations going to be happening this year. So let's fast forward a little bit. If nothing changes, nothing gets solved, and definitely don't expect the East Coast one to get solved quickly because West Coast should be similar. By the second half of the year, barring obviously any breakthroughs, we are going to have 6 port workers unions in contract talks with waterfront employers at the same time. And this means that everything from the US West Coast, US East Coast, and Gulf Coasts are going to be in negotiation at the same time. And I just can't underestimate the amount of risk that is. I mean, we saw what happened to the West Coast when those port negotiations went sour. And in general, which totally makes sense, shippers decided to divert their shipments. They already dealt with 2 years of pandemic-related problems. And here, as we're exiting the pandemic, here comes another one. And not to mention, there was another series of things going on. We had AB5, just to name one of them. But now we're going to be in a situation, if our West Coast isn't resolved by the middle of the year, we will have literally all of our coasts, waterfront coasts, going through port negotiations. So it's definitely something to be considering and thinking about right now. We just went over rates for our China, Southeast Asia into the West Coast and East Coast lanes, and they are particularly low. That being said, there's a lot of blank sailings that have been just issued just to kind of keep the rates buoyed. There could be an argument staying to consider front loading more inventory, but we also have very low demand right now. So it's a very hard equation. I feel bad for the shippers right now. It's a very tough time. We'll really try to keep just watching, waiting, and analyzing this and other situations, and trying to inform you guys best of what some of our customers are doing from a best practice, what we're recommending from a best practice, to at least try to mitigate any potential challenges. So, okay, we can't take all day with this, so we are going to move forward. Let's go over to our transatlantic lanes. Now, remember, again, because it was a minute ago, we're just focusing on the ocean rate averages. It does not include the inland portion of the shipments. It's just the ocean rate averages. I'll apologize. Okay. Ugh, sinuses, no fun. Now, we talked about this before, but really the Europe to US trade lane, it's just been one of the lanes that, as we've seen the general downturn from lack of demand, but just to name one thing, across the other trade lanes of the world, the Europe to US trade lane has remained relatively strong and well above pre-pandemic levels when it comes to cost, and definitely when it comes to congestion, but that's obviously a little bit due to port shift. Now, we're looking into this though, and if we're looking at it right now, I am personally seeing from our rates that I'm seeing the first kind of stronger downward trend in price. 2 weeks ago, we reported that we were seeing rates at around the $5,000 point, and that was trending downward at a very, very bumpy pace from $6,000. And that higher point at 6,000 was all the way back in the first week of December. So very slow downward trend. Obviously, you're going through the holidays, you're going through just a lot of, a unique shipping time period where you really won't expect a necessarily clean trend, right? Obviously, other side of the world, but still affecting it, Chinese New Year. But what we've seen the past month has been a pretty clear and a little bit faster downward trend. So 2 weeks ago, $5,000 was our rate average right around that point. Right now, we're sitting at 4,350. It's definitely a big change, and it's something to keep your eye on. And personally, there's still a lot of room to go. I mean, our pre-pandemic rates were a lot lower. I mean, we were seeing rates of $1,500 back in 2019. Now, will we get that low? It's really tough to say. There's been a lot of proponents from the terminals coming out and saying, hey, pre-pandemic, the East Coast was not making money. It was too cheap for the cost of just operating. So I think there's going to be a lot more pressure to kind of try to prevent that. That being said, obviously we see what's coming out of China and Southeast Asia is way below what it needs to be to cover the costs. So, if the West Coast is any kind of canary in the coal mine situation, could happen to the East Coast as well. Um, there's a lot of things though happening in Europe, and there's a lot of different opinions. A lot of just not politically, but just the idea of like hard left, hard right opinions. And before I get into those, there's something I really want to mention, and I think it's very, very cool to kind of maybe change the pace a little bit. But okay, so U.S. regulators, they just approved the CP and the KCS railroad merger. And this means we have formed the very first single rail system slash company, right? You got to kind of differentiate those two, but it's now spanning between the US, Canada, and Mexico. And, obviously all the other rail lines were vehemently against this. They were like, but they're just jealous because now there's one rail system connecting all three of the countries in this top continent. It's fantastic. So very, very cool. I'm extremely excited about it. I think it's going to offer some interesting transportation solutions. But the thing I think I'm most excited about is with this operating under one company, as we, obviously they got to get into the details of how this will operate and such is between like, what are they separating? But I really would like to see anything that leads to more streamlining crossing borders in North America. Obviously we've got a lot of great systems that make it easy, but if we can make it easier, oh my gosh, that'd be fantastic. So I'm extremely excited about this. More to follow, and we will also watch, and analyze for you. Now, let's go over to our European partners. So one of the articles and one of the things that has been coming out through numerous articles is that the recession outlook kind of seems to be fading slightly. And the business community and the freight forwarders are also getting really excited about restock season. And they're pointing to this reduction in fuel costs as the reason for this excitement. It's saying, look, fuel costs are down. This will ease some of the effects of inflation, and we will hit restock season because demand will come back up. Now, personally, I'm not seeing it. We're really not seeing the pressure on the supplier side. And it's actually, there's been a lot of discussion in the beginning of this year, like, okay, when is the recession, when is the downturn going to happen? How long will it last for? What countries will it affect? Things like that. And I think the further we get into 2023, and I know we're just in the beginning, but given everything going on, all of us have to be thinking we always have to be thinking about peak season. What is peak season going to look like? Especially given just the lack of demand right now. Is peak season going to bring demand that will bring some stability to the season, to the system? And, in my opinion, I'm not seeing it quite yet. When you look at where, your earlier suppliers are, a lot of the rates out of Southeast Asia and China going around the globe are just incredibly low. And right now, if you look at Europe, you've got inventory and warehouses just totally maxed out. I mean, even our warehouse network, we're running at 95% capacity right now, and we're in the US. So it's, we have a lot of stock we've got to get through before we can really get to the restock. Now, to kind of counter what I'm saying, there was an executive, BASF, the BASF executive, and he basically, literally countering myself, said, look, shippers, they saw everything go into the complete gutter the last few years. And in terms of schedule reliability, they couldn't count on anything arriving when they needed it. So expect them to hold on to more safety stock until they are completely confident that they won't have to worry about these schedule reliability issues. And he's got an excellent point. He really does. And particularly when talking about Europe. So one of the major differences between Europe and the US when we talk about supply chains is they use a system of feeder vessels. And so it's kind of like you realize vessels feeding vessels to kind of shuttle things to other major ports and move things around. The Problem with those feeder vessels is when schedule reliability became a problem and congestion hit points where stuff wasn't moving, the feeder vessels also got affected and they are running shorter trips. They're doing more trips in a day and obviously smaller loads. When that system fell apart, it took their schedule reliability down to such a low point that it was terrifying. You couldn't count on anything and you didn't know when it was going to arrive. You likely knew where it was, but that was about it. So, you know, that comment in regards to the European market and why we're still seeing completely full warehouses, it makes a lot of sense. So, something to keep in mind. Let's move on. Let's move on and discuss our last major shipping lane and one that I briefly kind of touched on a minute ago. Apologies, I gotta. I'm just sinuses keeping me dry. Now, okay, took a minute. Remember, ocean rate averages, not inland portions of the shipment. We're going to talk about China to Europe. And I kind of want to come out pretty strong on this one right out of the gate and just say this lane is quite frankly, it's sort of plummeting in price. We talked about this earlier, but a lot of European companies have been shifting their suppliers, and this is partially due to the Ukrainian war. When that happened, you had just a portion of your shipping area that was kind of bad to be involved in. But that's not all of it, though. That didn't cause everyone to flock out. That's definitely not the case. We're also obviously seeing a demand slump, and now if you look at the volume coming out of China, and specifically you look into the European ports, we have been negative year over year since last February, and it's been continuing, and that's concerning, especially as we lapse so year over year negative on year over year negative. That doesn't mean China isn't pumping out as many things. Actually, been a huge surge of Chinese goods just going inland, going into Russia, which makes sense. It doesn't make them there's obviously a lot of politics on this, so I don't want to bridge into that category. But they've been long-term partners, and they've got a rail system that connects the two of them. It's much more expensive, actually, in comparison to the ocean routes, but it is an option. They can use it, and they have been using it. And I read a report that volume was up on that route almost 5 times. So there's been a volume shift for China as well. But looking at our rate averages right now, China to Europe, it's only $1,500. And that is so low. That is so unbelievably low. It's this lane I used to call the barometer of global shipping because it was really steady. It would change kind of just kind of give you a good idea of what was going on in general. It kind of lost that during the Ukrainian crisis because it obviously got very unstable because of that. And but still, if we go before that, during the pandemic, we saw this lane, which was slower and steadier than the rest of them. It sat at $18,000 at the average cost of a shipment, and it sat there for over a month. And now it's $1,500, and that's wild. The lane also represents a lot of stops. There's a lot of places a lot of ports and a lot of developing areas that have been, becoming new suppliers to other countries and, the US as well. But it's just very interesting. Keep that in mind. Now, there's a lot obviously to unpack, and it's kind of hard to do a proper deep dive into the reasons and everything going on here. We need to do it at some point. It's critical knowledge for everyone to consider, but we're not going to be doing it today. And just to make sure we stay on time, because wow, I am talkative today. We're going to move into air shipping. We're going to talk a little bit about our air rates, what we've been seeing. So let's first start out with China again. So China and Southeast Asia, you're shipping from there into the US. We still have this, and I mentioned this a lot, there's kind of this Asian rate seesaw. It's very, if you really want to work with your logistics team or your logistics provider or us to figure out when the best time is to ship, and you got to let them know as soon as possible, because if you can let them know 3 weeks out, a month out, they can likely save you quite a bit of money just kind of capitalizing on this fluttering rates that we see all the time. Now, I've got a great example of this too, and I'm really glad I brought that up. So last week, our average for our air shippers was $6.35 a kilo, but we had one customer reach out to us 4 weeks in advance and say, hey, it's not done yet, but we're going to need an air shipment. We're expecting it around this point. You're going to need a little bit of flexibility, but this is what we're expecting. We're able to lock them in at $5.90. So they definitely beat the rest of our customers just because they were reaching out to us as soon as possible prior to when the goods were completed, which we call our cargo ready date. So keep that in mind. Definitely, more time you give your logistics team, your logistics provider, or us, the more we can kind of find an interesting solution. We can find an alternate carrier. We can figure things out. We don't have any time. We can't. So keep that in mind. Best practice. Now let's move on. European air shipments coming into the U.S. So and I'm always going to do this. So get ready. I'm shamelessly plugging our partnership. It's really cool. We've been working with a company very closely called LLS. We've got a very integrated partnership. We every month we reserve space, and we've got an air console and we've got an ocean console. And if you want to have stable pricing coming out of Europe, and if you are, let's say you're shipping, you know, an air freight a month, you could parse that out into a weekly shipment. The LS team are just amazing at how they kind of scientifically built this. We're able to keep to a very specific schedule. And yeah, if you want more information on the consolidation, shoot an email out to me. I want to make sure you get the most accurate and you're talking to the right people to give you the breakdown of it. But it's very cool. But we have ocean and air, good way to kind of control costs and also, mitigate some of the expenses while rates are going down, particularly Europe to US. Now, that being said, talking about rates, if you're shipping a lot via air and let's just say it doesn't make sense to do a consolidation. Well, we do have customers where that is the case. And they saw on average around 277 a kilo last week, which is pretty good. Generally speaking, the European air freight market is relatively stable. We have a lot of capacity going back and forth. There was also a lot of moves to increase capacity over the pandemic, and I'm talking about in major levels. Obviously, passenger flights, but air freighters as well. So 277 is what we saw. Also have a consolidation program, could save you money and be great with scheduling. Finally, let's talk about our Central and South America to US air shipping lanes. Now, currently they're really cheap, and I've seen these rates go kind of surprisingly high, especially considering how close we are. Um, there are a lot of things going on, and we have seen this rate a little bit cheaper, but this is probably a component that's adding to the cheapness. So we've got some political tensions happening in South America. And also some runaway inflation that's going on with some of our Gulf neighbors, or a little bit further south than our Gulf neighbors. But last week, our averages came in at 234 a kilo. And it's not, as I mentioned, the lowest we've seen, but it's definitely a good rate, especially right now. So if you do need to ship, it is a good time. Do remember that if you have cargo ready and you want to ship now, it's going to be more challenging. Try to give us at least 2 weeks if possible. Obviously, if you can't, we'll do what we can, and we tend to do a good job. But keep that in mind. Now, little context for those things I just mentioned. So Argentina, in particular, they're seeing some very challenging inflation woes right now. So their yearly inflation rate rose past 100% year over year in February. It's the first time it's hit that high in the past 30 years. That being said, right before that 30-year point, there was some really crazy inflation. And I don't have the whole deep story on that, so that's as far as I'm going to talk about that. Now, I tried to get a good peg on Brazil's current inflation rate, and really the most accurate thing I can say about that is the government had a target for inflation of just under 4%, but the data seems to be suggesting they're closer to 6%. They did have a little surge in inflation last year, and that was mainly around Q1, but that does seem to be settling down, which is a good thing. We do a lot of business out of Brazil, and we've got an office, so it is, kind of on the ground. We deal with a lot of shippers down there as well, and a lot of project cargo as well. So yeah, let's move on. Final category, oil and gas. And I've got 1 minute. I'll go really fast. So right now, we are looking at a nationwide diesel average sitting at roughly 425 a gallon. And that is down from last week and the week before. About 2 weeks ago, we were at 430 a gallon. So year over year, we've seen a drop in diesel of over $1. So it is very important that if you're still paying the same fuel surcharge rates, to start to consider putting pressure on those carriers. Some were negotiated later in the year. We've been seeing a downward trend for a while. It's kind of cool because we obviously had the surge in diesel prices after the Ukraine war started. It kind of popped it up. We're past the anniversary of the Ukraine war, but we are down year over year, and we're at a point where we're very competitive to what we were before. So Keep that in mind. In January, there was a couple major businesses that did change their fuel surcharge rates across all of their customers, and they tend to be a little bit different from a lot of the shippers we work with. But I just want to make sure we mention them. So Amazon removed the 5% fuel surcharge increase they implemented last summer, and then Uber and Lyft dropped theirs. And there's also a few other companies, but all of this happened in January. Right now, we're still seeing rates trend downward for diesel, which is great. And that's what I got for you today. We're on a new platform, so I don't even know how to talk to my marketing director yet.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I guess we'll see you next week, right?
Yes, and make it a great day. It's weird with Anthony not saying that. Oh well.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you all. Bye.